Hello, and welcome to a Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness video. Now, I just completed my Kanto run, using all the Pokemon in this game from Gen 1. However, everyone knows that once that game is completed, there is still one challenge left to do, and that is to brave Cerulean Cave and pick up the Legendary Mewtwo, the most powerful Pokemon in the game, and with it you complete your Pokedex. However, that's not the end of the story, because Mewtwo is a clone of another. And according to the logs on Cinnabar Island, it came from Mew, and so it's time to see whether or not the original or the replica is the better of the two. So with that, I'm going to make my pick, and I'm going to say that Mewtwo is going to come out on top in this challenge because it has 106 HP, 110 attack, 90 defense, 154 special attack, 90 special defense, and 130 speed, making it exceptionally fast, exceptionally strong, and with 90 base defenses, surprisingly bulky as well. Now moving over to its moves, and through level up it gets access to mostly normal and psychic type moves, and it even gets to start with confusion. However, this is probably the only flaw that Mewtwo has, and that is the fact that it doesn't get a lot of attacking moves through level up, and it only gets moves every 10 levels, which unfortunately means that it doesn't get its best attacking move Psychic until level 66. Now luckily there is a TM for that, and I guess that perfectly segues us over to the TMs and Tutor segment, where it basically gets everything it could ever want. Ice, fire, electric, ground, fighting, ghost, and so much more is open to Mewtwo. So I think it's going to do exceedingly well, however, dark types are going to be a bit of an issue. Anyway, with that, we now move on to our Mewtwo in particular, which has a quiet nature, raising its special attack, but lowering its speed. Honestly, that's perfectly fine. It already has 130 base speed, and that extra special attack is only going to help it. Now moving on, it has the pressure ability, which doubles the foe's PP usage. It will come in handy in a couple fights. And then at level 10, Mewtwo starts with Confusion and Disable. So with that, we get right into it, and the first thing I need to do is go over to the Tutor Lady to go pick up Seismic Toss, that way I can hit Dark types. And then at level 11, Mewtwo gets Barrier, which raises its defense by 2 stages, which will definitely come in handy. And then I go into the battle against the Old Man, where none of his Pokemon really pose that much of a threat. Instead, I'd like to take this moment to talk about Mewtwo's animations, because all of them are, quite frankly, incredible. They're really well done. There's a lot of force put into everything he does. His eyes turn blue when he's attacking or defending, and that leads me into the question, do you like a more serious Mewtwo or a more nonchalant type of Mewtwo? Like a Mewtwo that just waves its hands and things go flying. Personally, I think I enjoyed this game's interpretation with a more serious one, though that is partially due to growing up with the first Pokemon movie, where Mewtwo is more of a conflicted character. Though I suppose the circumstances of one's birth are irrelevant. Anyway, now moving on to the Power Rangers, where today I decided to fight Purple because I have super effective damage against all of his Pokemon. The only real issue is Grimer going for Disable, which does throw a bit of a wrench in my plan to go through this battle as quick as possible, though neither of these Pokemon are all that threatening, and Seismic Toss still does a decent amount of damage. After a couple turns, Confusion is relinquished back to Mewtwo, and now I can go for Confusion into Gulpin, which doesn't take it down in a single hit. I take down Grimer so I can't do it again, and then I finish off Gulpin, and with that, we move into the Cypher base, where at level 22, Mewtwo gets the move Swift, which I teach over Disable, and then Mewtwo nearly suffers its first loss here. Luckily, I had decided to go for a Barrier right before this turn, so I am able to narrowly survive. So now with Naps defeated, I move on to the battle against Lavrina. She leads with a Love Disc and a Beautifly, and right away I go for Confusion into the Beautifly, which takes it down in a single hit. Then she sends out Roselia. It's part poison, so it absolutely goes down in a single hit. And then she sends out her final Pokemon, which is a Shadow Delcatty. Now, it is quite bulky, and so I do suspect it is going to survive at least one hit. And it does, but it takes well over half, so one more Confusion is able to finish it off, and all that's left is the Love Disc, which has done almost nothing to me this entire fight. And so with one Confusion, I actually surprisingly don't take it down. It gets taken down to low red. Okay, well, it gets taken down eventually, and we beat Lavrina. So with that, we now move on to the obligatory Mirror Bee. How are you doing today, Mirror Bee? Well, anyway, with that, this will act as a great segment point to move over to our other contestant, Mew, who has 100 HP, 100 attack, 100 defense, 100 special attack, 100 special defense, and 100 speed, making it very fast, very bulky, and also quite strong. Now moving over to its moves, and unlike Mewtwo, it gets access to mostly normal moves, though importantly, it does get Psychic at level 40, which does give it a leg up on eventually getting Psychic, and it also gets Ancient Power at level 50, which is probably the best move in the game for the final boss. Now moving on to its TM and Tutor moves, and it gets everything, and everything that XD has to offer. There are 3 moves that are an exception to this, but they don't really matter for this run. Now, I know looking at the stats and the moves, Mew doesn't really have anything to set itself apart from Mewtwo. However, there is one notable thing it has, and that is that it is in the medium-slow level up group. So it is going to be leveling up significantly faster than Mewtwo, so there is a chance that it will just win based on a severe level advantage. Now moving on to our Mew in particular, and I also gave it a quiet nature, giving it special attack and lowering speed, because if Mewtwo is meant to be a clone, I assume that the original might still have that nature. It originally started with Timid, which didn't really seem all that great for it. Now moving on, it gets the Synchronize ability, which causes any status problems to inflict it to go back onto the target, which does come in handy occasionally, and it starts with Pound and Transform. Notably worse, but we can go straight over to the Move Tutor to go pick up Seismic Toss, and because Mew levels up quicker, it's more useful for it as well. I go ahead and teach Mew Bullet Seed, and then I go into the battle against the old man. Now, as you might suspect, Mew isn't going to be able to completely destroy his Pokemon. Well, that was a crit pound, but on average, it's not going to be doing as much damage as Mewtwo was. Though, with that being said, it still does get through this fight very easily. The other thing to note is that Mew's animations are absolutely wonderful. Like, I know I'm playing that animation at 4 times speed, but the gracefulness of it doing a spin whenever it does Seismic Toss is very nice. And it gets the move Mega Punch eventually, and it uses the same animation as it does for Pound, so it's just got these tiny little hands getting thrown as far forward as the model can reasonably go to make it look like it's punching something. Now, unlike Mewtwo, it doesn't have an exceptionally strong move to get through that early game, and so I'm going to go ahead and go over to Mount Battle. That way I can get a few levels, which should hopefully help it later on in the run, and by the end of it pick up the TM for Water Pulse. But on the way, at level 20, Mew gets the move Mega Punch, which I teach over Transform, and then I go ahead and teach Water Pulse right away over Pound. And so we'll have to see if that 10-minute detour ends up working out in Mew's favor or not, but now we move on to the Power Rangers, where I fight Red because he has the fused amount of Pokemon, and I can take him down very quickly with Water Pulse. And so, oh, Houndour actually survived. Okay, well, Water Pulse finishes the job, and now we move into the Cypher base, where, with nothing really happening, we now move on to the battle against Lavrina. She leads with a Love-Disc and a Beautifly, and right away I go ahead and call Mew to raise the accuracy of Mega Punch, that way I can use it throughout the rest of the fight. And Mega Punch doesn't quite take down Beautifly, but it's not really doing much in return. I go for a Water Pulse to go ahead and finish it off, and then she sends out her Roselia once again, and it should absolutely go down to a single Mega Punch, which it does, and then she sends out her final Pokemon, that Shadow Delcatty, and once again, I doubt it's going to go down in a single hit, though Mega Punch should deal quite a lot of damage, actually nearly taking it down in a single hit. Another Mega Punch, of course, finishes it off, and then all that's left is Love-Disc, and one more Mega Punch finishes the battle, and Lavrina is defeated. So with that, we meet up with Mirabee once again, and now it's time to see just how our 2 competitors are doing. Now, because of the slight detour, it's no surprise that Mew is in second place right now, though it is only 20 minutes behind, and Psychic is only 10 levels away from Mew, so it will be able to get that before the next major boss, and should hopefully allow Mew to close that gap a bit. Though, we do have to get all the way to Cinnabar Isle, and after the next boss is the Psychic TM, so Mewtwo definitely has time to pull ahead once again. So with that, let's go ahead and get back into it, and let's continue with Mewtwo's story. Now, over at the top of the ONBS building, I go ahead and pick up the Ralts for the Twisted Spoon item to raise Psychic type damage by 10%, and then Mewtwo finally suffers its first loss. I don't think I recorded it, but Mew also suffered its first loss here as well. Anyway, now moving on to the Real Gam Tower, where I go and pick up my 2 favorite TMs, Hidden Power and Protect, and at the same time, I'll pick up the TM for Fire Blast, that way I can deal with the upcoming Steel types. And Mewtwo was gifted Hidden Power Ice, which is a pretty good Hidden Power type, though the Ice Beam TM is coming up fairly soon, so it's not going to be the most useful. Also, it's only 40 base power. Now moving on to Phoenix City, where I pick up the Swinub for the Never Melt Ice item to raise Ice type damage by 10%. And then before the next fight, I teach Mewtwo Ice Beam over Hidden Power, and then Fire Blast over Barrier before going into the battle against Snaddle. He leads with a Quagsire and a Lantern, and right away I go for Ice Beam into the Quagsire to take it down in a single hit, and then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Shadow Lunatone, and Shockwave from Lantern really doesn't do that much damage. Ice Beam isn't quite enough to take down the Lunatone, despite it being neutral, and so it is able to set up Shadow Sky, though that doesn't really matter too much. It just guarantees that every other Pokemon coming up I should be able to take down in a single hit. Out comes Castform, and another round of Fruity Pebbles, and I go for Ice Beam into it, taking it down in a single hit, and then he sends out his final Pokemon, which is a Metang. And at this point, I have two options. I can either take down the Lantern, or I can take down the Metang, though it is a 15% chance to miss on Metang, so I decide to go for Lantern. But unfortunately, Confusion isn't quite enough to take it down, and I'm taken all the way down to 8 HP, so now I have to rely on Lantern hitting itself in Confusion, which Metang goes down to the Fire Blast, luckily, and thankfully, Lantern goes down to Confusion. A very close fight. Now moving on, and Mewtwo gets the Psychic TM, which I teach over Confusion, and then I go into the battle against Gonzap. Now, I could have taught Protect to avoid a Spark, but Electrode is actually just going for Sonic Boom, which I'm very grateful for. I take it down in a single Psychic, and then out comes Vileplume, which also goes down to a single Psychic. And then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Whiscash, and this might be able to survive a Psychic. So I decide to go ahead and swap targets and take down the Nuzleaf first, and then he sends out his final Pokemon, which is a Skarmory. Hyper Beams really aren't doing too much damage. I go for Fire Blast, which luckily does hit and takes down Skarmory in a single hit, and then all that's left is that Whiscash, which apparently absolutely goes down to a single Psychic. So with that, we defeat Gonzap with relative ease, and now we move on, where I teach Thunderbolt to Mewtwo over Swift, and then at the top of the tower, I teach Earthquake over Fire Blast before going into the battle against Gorgon. I then go for a Thunderbolt into the Celio to take it down in a single hit, and then he sends out Slowking, which I decide to go for Earthquake, which takes down the Lairon and deals a decent amount of damage to Slowking. And it was at this point that I was reminded that Mewtwo is no slouch on the physical side. Anyway, I go for Thunderbolt to finish off the Slowking, and then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Shadow Primeape, and I go for Psychic to take it down, and oh, I've just been reminded, I forgot to talk about the animation for Psychic. No, it's obvious that it's kind of modeled to go around a sphere, so a move like Shadow Ball, but it definitely works for Psychic as well. Anyway, I take down Ursaring, and then all that's left is his Shadow Hypno, and I go for Thunderbolt into it. It survives on a little bit of HP, and one more Thunderbolt finishes it off. So with that, a very easy Gorgon, and Mewtwo is now going to the final area of the game, and that was exceptionally fast. So we'll have to see how Mew does. So, just like Mewtwo before, I pick up Ralts for the Twisted Spoon item to raise Psychic type damage by 10%, and then I run over to the Railgun Tower to go pick up my two favorite TMs, and also Fire Blast for the exact same reason as before. And even though I never ended up teaching Hidden Power, Mew has Hidden Power Fighting. Not all that great. Anyway, I decide to teach Fire Blast over Seismic Toss, and then we move on, where I go ahead and pick up the Swinub for the Never Melt Ice item, once again for that 10% ice damage. And then at level 40, Mew gets the move Psychic, which I decide to teach over Bullet Seed before going into the battle against Snaddle. He leads with a Lantern and a Quagsire, and I go for Psychic into Quagsire right away to take it down. Mew is actually a little more threatened by Quagsire than Mewtwo was because of its lower speed, so I definitely didn't want to be hit by Rock Tomb. I go for Water Pulse into Lunar Tone, but unfortunately it's not quite enough to take it down, and so it's able to set up Shadow Sky. I go for another Water Pulse to finish it off, and then he sends out his Castform once again. And the Shockwaves from Lantern really not doing that much damage, and doing significantly less than it was to Mewtwo. Go for a Psychic into Castform to take it down, and then he sends out his final Pokemon, that Metang once again. And unlike last time, I am actually just going to go for Fire Blast right away, because I have learned my lesson from the Mewtwo fight. It goes down in a single hit, and then all that's left is the Lantern, which I can just go for Psychic, and it should absolutely take it down in a single hit. Which it does, and we're able to beat Snaddle on the first attempt. Now moving on, and I teach Ice Beam over Mega Punch before going into the battle against Gonzap. He leads with a Nuzleaf and an Electrode, and I go ahead and call to raise the accuracy of Fire Blast to make sure it can hit his Pokemon further down the line. Luckily, the Electrode here is also going for Sonic Boom, so I don't need to worry about getting paralyzed on the first turn. And then out comes the Vileplume, which I go for Psychic into, which takes it down in a single hit, and then out comes his Whiscash once again. And Nuzleaf's feint attacks really aren't doing too much damage. I go for another Psychic to take down Whiscash, and then he sends out his final Pokemon, his Skarmory. and I go for Fire Blast to take it down, before using one last Fire Blast to take down the Nuzleaf. Now, this was the last area that Mew had the advantage of having Psychic, so unless it closed that gap, it might be a struggle from here on out. Anyway, I teach Thunderbolt over Fire Blast, and then soon after I get the move Ancient Power at level 50, which I teach over Water Pulse before going into the battle against Gorgon. He leads with the Celio and Lairon, and right away I go for Thunderbolt into the Celio, taking it down in a single hit, and then he sends out his next Pokemon, that's Slowking once again. Unlike Mewtwo, I don't actually have Earthquake to take down the Lairon on this turn, so I decide to take down the Slowking instead. Unfortunately, I get hit by an Iron Tail, which lowers my defense. Go for Psychic to take down Ursaring, and then out comes his Shadow Primeape. And Psychic absolutely takes it down, though the Lairon is now doing significantly more damage. He sends out his final Pokemon, the Shadow Hypno, and Iron Tail takes me down to half, lowers my defense again, so I absolutely need to get rid of this Lairon, and then all that's left is the Shadow Hypno, which will not go down in a single hit, I doubt anyway. I go for Ancient Power, no Omni Boost, and it doesn't even take it down to half, so I swap over to Ice Beam, and it finishes it off. So with that, Mew is now going on to the last area of the game, and so we now move over to the graph, where the time is actually widened even further, with Mewtwo at 4 hours, 32 minutes, and 54 seconds, and Mew at 5 hours, 4 minutes, and 46 seconds. So they've gone from about 20 minutes apart to about 30 now. So clearly the early Psychic didn't quite do enough to push them together, though it probably kept them closer than it would have been otherwise. And I'll probably mention this again at the end of the video, but right now they are only 5 levels apart, so maybe the level advantage wasn't as wide as I thought it was going to be. But anyway, with that, we now continue back over to Mewtwo, going into the battle against Lavrina once again, and she leads with a Gorbis and a Gardevoir this time, and right away I go for Thunderbolt into the Gorbis to take it down in a single hit, and then she sends out our next Pokemon, which is a Roselia. Now, I do have Earthquake, and I know that'll take down Roselia, but it also takes down Gardevoir as well, and then she sends out our next 2 Pokemon, which is a Shadow Farfetch'd and a Shadow Altaria. Now, because the Farfetch'd is going to go for Shadow Panic, usually I would take it down first, but it's not all that accurate, and I thought it'd be faster to just take down Altaria and have that miss. Unfortunately, it didn't, though I didn't hit myself in confusion, and I take her down fairly quickly anyway. Now moving on to the battle against Snattle, he leads with a Metang and a Quagsire this time, and I go for Earthquake right away, which takes down the Metang, but doesn't quite take down the Quagsire. Then he sends out Scizor, and my speed gets dropped, though that probably won't matter. Go for another Earthquake, which does finish off the Quagsire and deals a decent amount of damage to the Scizor. Then out comes his next Pokemon, which is a Shadow Solrock. Silverwind does a ton of damage. I did not expect that, so I go ahead and take down Scizor this turn, and then he sends out Castform. Solrock is able to set up Shadow Sky, and so I decide to take it down on the following turn. And with Solrock gone, he sends out his final Pokemon, which is a Shadow Starmie. And that too will go down to a single Thunderbolt, so all that'll be left is the Castform after these Fruity Pebbles, and oh, Starmie actually outspeeds after a single speed drop. Interesting. Well, there's no way Castform really does that much damage. Okay, that was actually significantly closer than I thought, but Castform goes down, and with that we beat Snattle. Now, right before the next fight, I decide to teach Protect over Earthquake before going into the battle against Ardos. He leads with a Shadow Swallow and Alakazam, and right away I go for Protect because I expected the Swallow to go for Shadow Half on the first turn because my HP is above 200. Unfortunately, that didn't end up being the case, so I go for Thunderbolt to take down the Swallow, and then he sends out Kingdra. Alakazam goes for Ice Punch, though it's not really doing that much damage, and at this point I decide I'm going to actually keep the Alakazam alive and take down the rest of his Pokemon. I do risk being frozen by his Ice Punches, but of course that's a small chance, and it's not really doing too much damage to me anyway, not more than I can just heal up. So with that, I take down the Kingdra with Psychic, and then he sends out Heracross, and with only 1 turn left of Shadow Sky, I go ahead and Protect, and it fades away. So I go for Psychic to take down the Heracross, and then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Shadow Electabuzz, and that too will go down to a single Psychic, which then brings out his final Pokemon, which is a Shadow Snorlax. Now, at this point, I think I'm going to swap targets and take down the Alakazam, because I'm going to have the Snorlax purposely hit me. Go for Ice Beam, and it finishes off Alakazam with a crit, though I don't think it was necessary. Snorlax hits, does a good amount of damage. I go for Psychic, and it takes it down from a little over half. So with that, we beat Ardos, and now we move on to Gorgon, who leads with a Slowking and an Ursaring. And right away, I go for Thunderbolt into the Slowking, taking it down in a single hit, and then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is an Aggron. I go for Psychic into the Ursaring to take it down in a single hit, and then he sends out his Walrein. Aggron goes for Iron Tail, which unfortunately lowers my defense. Though it wasn't really doing too much damage, I go for Thunderbolt to take down the Walrein, and then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Shadow Poliwrath. That should go down to a single Psychic, and then that brings out his final Pokemon, which is a Shadow Mr. Mime. And because my defense was lowered, I'm actually going to get rid of the Aggron now. And then all that's left is that Mr. Mime, who really doesn't do too much damage with Shadow Storm. So I go for Thunderbolt, and it goes down to a single hit. So now moving on to the battle against Eldis, he leads with a Shadow Manectric and Ninjask, and right away I go for Psychic into the Manectric, taking it down in a single hit, and then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Shadow Salamence. And because Ninjask sees super effective damage with Silverwind, it's going to use that every single turn. Unfortunately, the very first one does give it an Omni Boost, but because of Mewtwo's Pressure ability, it can only actually use 3 of them. So after this one, it's no longer getting super effective damage on me. I go for Ice Beam to take down Salamence, and then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Flygon, which also goes down to an Ice Beam, and then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Shadow Marowak. And usually this thing is pretty threatening, though once again I can just go for an Ice Beam and take it down in a single hit, which then brings out his final Pokemon, which is a Shadow Lapras. And despite it being quite bulky, I doubt it's going to survive a Thunderbolt. So one Thunderbolt and it goes down, and all that's left is Ninjask, which is going to protect this turn, wasting a couple seconds, but it goes down all the same. And with that, we now move on to the battle against the big box legendary Shadow Lugia. And right away I go for Thunderbolt, which takes it down to low red. Unfortunately it does survive, hits a Shadow Storm, dealing a little bit of damage back. I protect to heal up a bit, and then another Thunderbolt finishes it off. So now moving on to the final battle against Greeful, and he leads with a Shadow Rhydon and Moltres, and I go for Protect to go ahead and heal up the damage that I took in the previous fight, and then I go for Ice Beam to take down Rhydon because I just don't really want to deal with Rhydon luck, and I know Moltres probably isn't going to deal that much damage unless it burns. And so the first attempt did end in a loss, but that's alright. I go back in for a second attempt. Now Mewtwo is at full health though, so I don't need to waste the first turn protecting. I take down Rhydon just as before, and then out comes Exeggutor. Moltres doesn't burn this time, and so I go for Protect to heal up a bit, and then I go for Thunderbolt to take it down. And then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Tauros. And in terms of difficulty, I think it would have been better to take down the Exeggutor this turn, but in terms of going as fast as possible, you want to take down Tauros because the Shadow Sky takes up precious seconds. So I take down the Tauros, and then unfortunately Exeggutor hits again, so I'm forced to protect this turn to heal up a bit to make sure I'm out of range of Exeggutor taking me down. Go for Thunderbolt into the Articuno, taking it down in a single hit, and then he sends out his final Pokemon, which is a Shadow Zapdos. Luckily Exeggutor does miss. I go for Ice Beam to take down the Zapdos in a single hit, and Exeggutor misses again. I take it down with an Ice Beam, and with that I beat Greeful on the second attempt. Not too bad. Now moving back over to Mew, and we go into the battle against Lovrano once again, and I go for Thunderbolt into the Gorvis right away, taking it down, then out comes Roselia. Unfortunately, Mew does not have Earthquake in this, so I go for Ice Beam to take down the Roselia, and then she sends out her Shadow Farfetch'd. And unlike last time, I am actually going to take down Farfetch'd first, because it is definitely the bigger threat. And then she sends out her final Pokemon, that Shadow Altaria, and I go for Ice Beam to take it down, and all that's left is Gardevoir, which it might actually survive a single attack. I go for Ancient Power, and it survives on a little bit. Maybe I should have gone for Ice Beam or Thunderbolt here, but doesn't matter. Take her down, and with that we now move on to the top of the volcano, where I run into Snaddle once again. He leads with a Quagsire and Matang. Go for Psychic to take down the Quagsire right away, and then out comes Scizor. I don't have fire damage, but I do have Thunderbolt, which unfortunately doesn't quite take it down, though Mew does take the Silverwind a lot better than Mewtwo did. Go for Ancient Power, hoping for an Omni Boost when unfortunately I don't get it. Then he sends out his Shadow Solrock, and I go for Ice Beam into it, hopefully taking it down in a single hit, which it does, and then he sends out Cast Form. And Cast Form absolutely goes down to a single Psychic, so it's a very easy KO, and then he sends out the Shadow Starmie. Now, unlike Mewtwo, I know for a fact I'll be able to outspeed it because I haven't had my speed dropped, so Thunderbolt takes it down in a single hit, and then all that's left is that Matang, which also goes down to a single Thunderbolt. So a very easy Snaddle. We now move on to Ardos, who leads with his Shadow Swallow and Alakazam. And since I don't have Protect, I'm just going to immediately take down the Swallow. It might have gone for Shadow Half, but as we saw in the Mewtwo one, it didn't, so there's a very likely chance it wouldn't anyway. I go ahead and take down the Alakazam now, and then this time I actually leave Kingdra around because its Hydro Pumps really don't do too much damage. Go for Psychic to take down the Heracross, and then out comes his Shadow Electabuzz, and another Hydro Pump hits, taking me down about a quarter. Go for Psychic to take down the... Oh, Electabuzz actually survives. Goes for a Shadow Storm, taking me down a half. Hydro Pump takes me down to just below half. I go for Psychic to finish off the Electabuzz, and then he sends out his final Pokemon, the Shadow Snorlax. And at this point, things are getting a little close. I go for Psychic, which does take down the Kingdra, and Snorlax misses. Okay, I go for Ancient Power. It's not doing a lot, and Snorlax misses. Another Ancient Power, takes it down below half, and Snorlax... Oh my goodness, this is incredibly lucky. I probably should have just gone for Psychic, though. Anyway, now moving on to Gorgon, he leads with the Slowking and Ursaring, and right away I go for Thunderbolt into the Slowking, taking it down in a single hit, and then he sends out his Aggron. And I go for Thunderbolt into the Aggron, taking it down in a single hit before he sends out his next Pokemon, the Walrein. Ursaring goes for Slash, not really doing too much damage, and the only way it will do a lot of damage is if it crits. Thunderbolt takes down Walrein in a single hit, and then out comes Poliwrath, his first Shadow Pokemon, and I go for Psychic into it, taking it down in a single hit, and then he sends out his final Pokemon, which is a Shadow Mr. Mime. And I thought that I could take it down with a single Ancient Power, but unfortunately, it actually survives with just a little bit of HP, so he goes for Shadow Storm. It doesn't really do that much, and Slash actually does get a crit, taking me down a half. I go for Ice Beam to take it down, and then all that's left is that Ursaring, which goes down to a Psychic, and so with that, Gorgon is defeated, and we now move on to Eldis, who leads with his Ninjask and Shadow Manectric. And right away I go for Psychic into the Shadow Manectric so it can't set up Shadow Sky, and then he sends out Salamence. And unlike Mewtwo, Ninjask actually gets to use all 5 of its Silver Winds, and because I haven't taught Protect yet, I won't even be able to avoid them, so I am just hoping that it doesn't get an Omni Boost. Which is why, after I take down the Salamence, I decide to go ahead and take down Ninjask, and then out comes his Shadow Marowak. And Flygon has Crunch, which is something I really hadn't considered, and it gets a special defense drop, which is really unfortunate because after the Shadow Marowak comes out, he sends out Lapras, which, because it sees a KO, is just going to go for Shadow Storm and take Mew down. Definitely a bit of an unlucky fight with that crit and the special defense drop, but I definitely could have played that a bit better. So I go back into the fight once again, take down Manectric just as before. However, this time I'm just going to get rid of Ninjask earlier. Salamence is going to deal a decent amount of damage, but I doubt it's going to be all that strong. Ancient Power actually gets an Omni Boost, so now I have better defenses for it as well. Out goes Flygon. Shadow Rush deals almost nothing now. I go for Ice Beam to take down the Flygon, and then he sends out his Shadow Marowak once again, which I know goes down to a single Ice Beam. Now the only thing that could realistically hurt me is if Salamence were to get a crit. But what is the likelihood of that, right? Anyway, the Lapras comes out, and I get taken all the way down to low red with a critical hit. I go for Thunderbolt, which takes down Lapras, and luckily I'm able to survive with 13 HP and finish off Salamence. Definitely a lucky fight that could have been remedied by Protect, but I really wanted to keep Ancient Power. Anyway, with that we now move on to Shallow-Lugia, and I go for Thunderbolt, which does half to it. Shadow Storm deals a little bit of damage back, and I go for another Thunderbolt to finish it off before going into the battle against Greavil. He leads with the Shadow, Rhydon, and Moltres, and right away I go for Ice Beam into the Rhydon, just like with Mewtwo, taking it down in a single hit, and then out comes Shadow Executor. Moltres goes for Shadow Fire, though luckily this one doesn't burn. Go for Ancient Power into the Legendary Bird, taking it down in a single hit, and then out comes Tauros, which lowers my attack, so that means that Ancient Power might not have a KO on the Articuno. I go for Ice Beam to take down the Executor, because unlike Mewtwo, I'm not really looking for the extra speed, I'd rather the survivability with how low my health is getting. I go for Thunderbolt into the Articuno, which doesn't take it down in a single hit, and it hits a Shadow Chill, finishing me off. Okay, well that's alright. I go back into the battle once again, after using a rare candy, and I forgot to mention it, but I also used a rare candy for Mewtwo at the end. Anyway, I go back in again, I go for Ice Beam to take down the Rhydon just as before, and I go for Ancient Power into the Moltres, hoping for that Omni Boost. Unfortunately, I don't get it, then out comes Tauros. And unlike last time, Executor actually goes for Shadow Hold, so this time I decide to take down Tauros first, and then he sends out Articuno, and I want to see which one's better between Thunderbolt and Ancient Power. I know there's a bit of a discrepancy in level here, but it seems that Ancient Power would have done a little more damage, so I go for it a couple times to take down Articuno, and then he sends out his final Pokemon, that Shadow Zapdos, and Executor luckily misses. I go for Ice Beam to take down the Executor, leaving just the Zapdos, which only does about a quarter. Another Ice Beam, and it takes it down a single hit. So with that, Mew and Mewtwo have both beaten the game, and it was pretty clear once we got to Cedar Dark Isle that Mewtwo was going to be the victor here. However, just how much of a victor was surprising, because it beat the game at a time of 5 hours, 52 minutes, and 41 seconds at level 64, with 2 feints throughout the game, 1 to Random Trainer, and 1 to Greevil. And now moving on to Mew, and it beat the game at a time of 6 hours, 37 minutes, and 50 seconds at level 70, with 3 feints throughout the game, 2 of those to bosses, and 1 of those to Random Trainers. So it's very clear that both of these Pokemon are incredibly powerful. However, Mewtwo stands above every other Pokemon on the tier list right now by a significant margin. It is 30 minutes faster than Kyogre, which was by far the top spot for a very long time, and it has completely trounced it. With that being said, Mew was no slacker because it actually ends up 4th on the tier list, right behind Flareon and Espeon. And compared to Jolteon and Espeon, it's a minute faster, but the main difference is that it just didn't lose as many times, so it's just much more consistent. So let's go ahead and go over their negatives and positives, of course starting with our winner, Mewtwo. And the positives are insane. Incredible stats, great move and type coverage, basically everything you could ever want. The only real downside, like I said at the beginning, is that its level up moves aren't that strong and it has to wait a long time before it gets really anything respectable, but it really doesn't matter when its special attack is so exceptionally high. Now moving on to Mew, and it's in a kind of similar boat. Its starting moves aren't that great, however they're definitely a step down from Mewtwo, and it doesn't learn any psychic type moves until level 40 through level up, so it has to rely a lot on its TM and Tutor moves throughout a lot of the game. With that being said though, because it gets access to every single TM and Tutor move in the game, it really just comes down to player choice what moves they want. It's a little bit restricted near the beginning, which is why I went ahead and got Water Pulse, because I thought that would speed things up. And while it was definitely helpful, giving it a solid move, once I got Mega Punch, Water Pulse was definitely kind of second fiddle, though the extra experience definitely did help to survive some of the battles a little more. I really thought, like I said, that level advantage was going to be bigger, but it didn't end up really doing much. And I was really hoping I'd get to Psychic a little bit faster, but right before Snaddle meant that there was only about 10 or so fights that Mewtwo had to do before it also got the move Psychic. And by that point, there was really nothing Mew could do. I know that all sounded kind of negative, but to be fair, both of these Pokemon are clearly incredibly powerful, with both of them ending up in the SS tier within top 5. So with that, if you did enjoy this video, consider liking and subscribing. If you have any Pokemon suggestions, please put them down below. Thank you so much for watching, and bye.